My next conversation with you is about the Nazis' use of propaganda between 1923 and 1933. Now, we could extend this conversation even further because the Nazis used a lot of propaganda right up until the end of their regime in 1945. Their wartime propaganda was quite different from their Weimar era propaganda. Their propaganda during the 1930s in power was very different to the Weimar era. They had different issues they were addressing, different issues that they wanted to promote, different conversations they wanted the public to have. So think of propaganda as like advertising. The Nazis were trying to come to power from 1923 to 1933, and this video is going to explore that. So let's have a look at a few bits of the propaganda during this era where the Nazis are trying to take power. In this one, in this first poster, this political poster, the Nazis are suggesting that they need to end corruption in the Weimar government. We have a bright red fist of Nazism smashing down on the table of Weimar politicians, including those with the red star of communism associated with them. These faces are a little unclear, but the face nearest to us, turned our way, actually has got some of the features of a Jewish stereotype they often use, the beard and so on. Another thing is that most of these characters here that the Nazis are smashing are fat in comparison to the fit, strong arm of Nazism. Fat often refers to greed and gluttony in political cartoons and political posters. This poster came out during the political campaigns after 1929, and it shows a sea of unemployed Germans. And it says essentially, our last hope, Hitler. So this is an image of the Nazis appealing to the unemployed people of Germany to vote for them as their last hope. It would also suggest that the Nazis would look after those people who were frightened of becoming unemployed. This is a disturbing and unpleasant little newspaper that the Nazis put out called the Stürmer, or the Stormer. It was the SA and SS's newspaper. It was often really quite violently and vilely anti-Semitic. And on the front cover of this propaganda newspaper, we've got a picture of a Jewish monster with the Star of David on his forehead, biting down on bodies. And of course, one of the bodies it's biting down on is a woman's body. And so it's full of some awful, awful anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic propaganda. And anti-Semitism was often a feature of Nazi propaganda. The photos I have down on the bottom left and in the centre here are photos of Nazi rallies, political meetings during the 1920s. And image in the middle I thought was interesting because it shows a group of SA and SS men meeting in a beer hall. We talk often about beer halls, but we don't have an idea of what they are. The Nazis would meet in any location where it could hold a large crowd, where they could get a booking, and where people would gather. And obviously, in a culture like Germany, where beer is popular as it is in Australia, the beer halls, what we probably call the pubs, the beer gardens. These were popular meeting places for the Nazis, often as ex-soldiers. This slogan on this poster, Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer, is a very famous Nazi slogan. We see the colouring of the Nazis here. We see the image of Hitler foremost and front and centre in their imagery. And it's one people, one regime, one nation, and one leader. And this gets at a few of those key ideas we know in Nazi ideology from some of our classwork. Have a look at some of those resources again in your study. By the way, if I go back here, Deutschland, which you'll see down the bottom there, is the German word for Germany. Hopefully you start recognising it. Let's move forward. So, the first thing I think we need to remember here is the Nazi propagandists, those people who created propaganda, appealed to the German people's desire for order and advertised the Nazi Party as particularly a protest movement against all the instability and ineffectiveness that was Weimar. If you wanted to protest all of those unpleasant things that you were experiencing socially, economically, and politically since the end of the First World War in Weimar Germany, if you had a grievance, the Nazi Party were the protest movement for you. They tried to present themselves as a protest movement. It was in rallies, big public meetings, in small meetings, in posters, in leaflets, in newspapers, and in speeches that Nazi Party propaganda portrayed the Weimar Republic as this confused mess, a morass, a stew of instability, corruption, and inaction at a time when the nation needed action, a time of national crisis. They also used the SA as a form of spreading propaganda, but let's not talk about the SA as much in this video. In a lot of the propaganda of the time, Hitler was promoted as a saviour, the Messiah for a German people, for the German nation. And we can see that in another one of my videos called Es liebe Deutschland. You can see that portrayal of Hitler as almost a Christ-like figure. It's quite disturbing how they've used Christian imagery to promote something that had such a dark, dark nature. The Nazi propagandists really made a big deal of the Volksgemeinschaft, and you can see it mentioned in this poster that has been inserted above my image here in the corner. Nazi propagandists said they were the only movement that spoke for all Germans, regardless of your class, religion, or region you lived in. It didn't matter if you're a farmer or a factory worker. It didn't matter if you were a Lutheran, a German, a Catholic, or something else. It didn't matter if you're an aristocrat, or working class, or middle class. The Nazis argued they were the only party that spoke for you. Interesting, they defined all Germans a little bit more narrowly than others in society. They excluded people of Jewish background. They excluded people who were of Roma background, the Gypsy background. They argued that those people were outside the people's community, as were others in their society, such as the homosexuals who I've mentioned before, such as communists and Marxists. These are people outside the people's community and therefore, as such, not really German. In some cases, they argued they're not even people. And we'll get to that later on in the course. But the Nazi propaganda positioned all of the other political parties as selfish, special interest groups who had narrow and self-centered causes. According to the propaganda, only the Nazis were willing to act, to sacrifice in the interest of the entire people of Germany, the people's community, the Volksgemeinschaft. Most of the Nazi propaganda between 23 and 33 pledged to unite Germany, to bring people together instead of splitting them apart like the communists might. And after 1929, they made a big, big effort to say only the Nazis could put all of the country's unemployed back to work. The propaganda promised that any of the political, economic, and social problems of the Weimar Republic would be resolved. Key in all of this is this concept of the people's community, the Volksgemeinschaft. And they said this was essentially a racial uniting of Aryan Germans that transcended, went beyond class, religion, region. So if we have a look again at my Volksgemeinschaft poster here, we see a good Aryan, truly German, racially pure family. A mother in a traditional role, a blonde-haired, fit-looking father with blonde-haired, fit-looking children, white skin, no hint of racial impurity. And this racism is often at the heart of Nazi imagery. You'll also see other images there, such as the German eagle, which picks up upon some of our Roman imagery that we spoke about earlier in our year. The Volksgemeinschaft, again, really focused on arguing that the Nazis would protect the national community first. That if everyone was looked after as a community, there would be no need to protect the selfish personal rights of the Weimar Constitution. Germans were encouraged to be good Kamerad, national comrades, who were encouraged to sacrifice for the common good. The Nazi propaganda sold a myth of community to Germans who longed for unity, pride, and a return to greatness. So let's now practice another primary source. Here's a German editorial cartoon published in 1931. It's published, obviously, during the Great Depression. The cartoon depicts Nazi gramophone records. Wow, if you don't know what vinyl records are, you'll have to go and ask your parents or grandparents. Before we downloaded music, we had CDs. Before we had CDs, we had vinyl records, and they were played on a gramophone. Gramophone had an arm with a little needle on it that ran along grooves on the vinyl track. You might want to Google that. Have a look at YouTube of what vinyl records looked like and how they played. So this cartoon's showing Nazi gramophone records mouthing slogans, and the slogans are Heil Hitler and Down with Jewry in German. It indicates the importance of the SA, and it indicates the spoken word propaganda that they used. So you're going to have to pause for a moment and have a little bit of a think and play with it, jot down a few ideas. Don't spend too long on it. Now's a good time to pause. I'm going to pause for a moment as well. I'll be back shortly, pretty much exactly after you click play again. Okay, so how'd you go? Let's see what I picked up in the cartoon and see how it matches your answers. Firstly, I picked up that our character marked A is Hitler. Slightly different drawing than what we're used to seeing in artworks and so on, but Hitler is in the uniform of the brown shirts, the SA, die Sturmabteilung. If you have any doubts that it's Hitler, note his moustache there. Pretty certain that's the telling sign of Hitler. Notice the mechanical arms that control the thoughts and the words of the SA. That also fits with the leader, Hitler, controlling the thoughts and words of his supporters. Now, these SA men, these two SA men, have their heads chopped off at about where the brain should be. So, our cartoonist here is suggesting that they have recorded voices, the words of someone else, instead of brains in their head. Okay? It's the recording and voice of Hitler and the lack of independent thought that is being emphasized here in this image. Lastly, when we have the Judenverrat comment here, we have a reference to the racist, the exclusive nature of this so-called Volksgemeinschaft, people's community. So we could have worked with that as an idea in your response.